This is The People's Voice. I'm Kerry McCarthy, and we're going to talk to Tony Wright via Skype just now about a theory he's developed concerning the human brain. Tony, your research and your book, Left in the Dark, outlines this idea about how the human brain isn't continually growing stronger and more intelligent through the process of evolution, but it's actually been degenerating for something like the past 200,000 years. Could you outline the basics of your theory for us?
I'll certainly try the basics. Yeah. Well, I think you've partly nailed it there. I'm really trying to draw attention just to the idea and raise the questions about our neural development, how our brain develops, because obviously while we may not be our brain as it were, it certainly seems to play a massively important part in our perception, our sense of who we are, and of course the decisions we make, and ultimately the kind of society and civilizations we've developed. So it's such a central element that that's really my focus, and really just challenging the idea that a lot of people have, certainly not everybody, that we've been evolving, advancing, things somehow are getting better, and we're getting more intelligent and so on. And just asking the question, well, actually, when you look around and you look at our behavior collectively and even as individuals, there seems to be some serious contradictions with this idea that we're evolving or becoming more intelligent, more advanced. And just drawing attention to whether there's any potential for our neural system, our brain, not to be working perhaps as well as it might. In fact, I've gone a step further than that, and I've really proposed that we're collectively suffering from a very serious neurological condition. So serious, in fact, parallels with dementia and so on. It's so serious that we don't even see how bad it is. We kind of blithely think we're okay. Give ourselves more or less a clean bill of health and march in the same direction we've been going for some while, which, a lot of people are quite aware that we're heading towards incredibly, devastating outcomes. We're already living in a time where we can see huge evidence of what seems to be a catastrophic failure in our ability to make sane decisions. It's back to this idea that we're suffering from some kind of form of insanity, and I'm certainly not the first person to have recognized this. And it's even interesting that historically and in recent times, some very intelligent, very creative people have considered humanity to be, quite literally insane in some way or other. So, lots of interesting pieces. And I'm just nailing this to the idea that is there something with the development and function of our brain that we've missed inevitably because the conditions left us blind to it?
So you mentioned in your book, part of this is delusion, and you can certainly see a mass denial about the fact that if we carry on the way we are, we'll die out pretty quickly, because some of the telltale signs for me are the fact at the moment in the West, we've got the older generation living off young people through industries like fast food, pornography, trashy entertainment, all industries that thrive off the destruction of young people's mental and physical health, and that's not exaggerating. And people love their children more than anything, and yet they manage to fool themselves that the way they live their lives isn't contributing to problems that are going to hit their children at some point in the future. So having focused on this for so long, do you see lots of other examples of this delusion everywhere you look now?
Yes, I suppose I do, quite a lot, really. In fact, I'd go as far as saying that the severity of the predicament we're in has eluded most people, even people who are proactive and very concerned. Again, what I'm really saying is species-wide and very serious, a sort of serious neural development problem, which has left us with severe perceptual limitations, behavioral problems, and an inability to perceive what's going on. So yes, coming back to delusion, that even our everyday behavior, let alone before we get to some of the more obvious things we're doing, the rigid rules we live by and the low level fear or paranoia that we're all trapped by, and yet we tend not to want to own up to, so from even the most basic day-to-day rituals and behavior that we know, if we step outside those boundaries, and of course they vary tremendously from one belief system or one culture to another, and so they're nothing to do with our biology, that's to do with all these ideas and concepts that we live rigidly by. right the way through to the kind of examples you're citing, yeah, I mean, I'd go as far as saying if you're willing to step back, and of course it's quite difficult to step back. You know, it's a bit like saying to somebody who has dementia, look, you've got dementia. If you step back, you can see this. But however, it is possible, I think, to some degree, to question everything. And if what I'm saying has any reality, then it won't just be extreme case scenarios. Every element of our behavior will be highly questionable, which is a very challenging idea. But if we're willing to look in the mirror, quite literally, it can become quite a liberating experience to recognize how, on the one hand, how serious the problem is. On the other hand, well, actually, if this is a human scale problem, if the problem lies within us, and really everything else is a manifestation of that, then it completely changes where we begin to address the problem. And I think it comes back to some of the information that's come down to us from many ancient mythologies and traditions that really more or less say this, that the problem lies within. It's not environmental destruction. It's not crazy politicians. It's not bankers. It's a universal human condition. These traits have been coming up in recorded history and simply getting worse. We've had sociopathic, psychopathic, hierarchical and patriarchal structures for several thousand years, and they always end up in the same place, trying to create incredibly rigid control systems that fly apart, and then they re-emerge, and then they fly apart. And of course it never works, but it creates absolute hell on earth while those processes unravel, and then finally it all breaks apart again. But the condition doesn't go away. You know, we know there are wonderfully different possibilities in terms of how we could live and how we could meet our needs, and yet these same sociopathic tendencies sort of emerge, rise to the top again, and we end up in the same place. So I don't think it's about any given culture or any time period. It's a progressive condition that we all have to some degree. I mean, I would think most of us, if we're truly honest, have days where we can see our behavior could be or might have been something we'd feel very uncomfortable with. And there's a whole spectrum. Some people are more trapped in that, some people less so. And we end up in situations where some of the most frightened and therefore least functional people, they naturally aspire to take control. You know, if you're frightened, you want to try and control things. And if that correlates with a condition that means inherently you're more deluded, less functional, that's a very dangerous combination. And so much of, you know, so many people are recognizing that we're often governed by people and individuals who have no grasp of reality whatsoever. And why does that keep happening? Why do these people keep emerging? You know, is there a factory churning them out somewhere, or is it innate in all of us? And again, you look at extreme conditions, most of us in certain circumstances could behave in those ways.
Okay, so that's the kind of thing we observe from people's behaviour, but is there a neurological basis for this too? I mean, the brain actually is getting smaller, isn't it? Even mainstream science accepts that.
There's been a lot of talk about the unique elements of our origins and our evolution, and particularly the expansion, the very large neocortex we have, which seems to act as some kind of executive layer when it comes to perception and our sense of self and so on, and how quickly that expanded. The rate of expansion, bearing in mind clearly species, animals don't need a particularly large neural system to successfully survive and compete, and it's very expensive to build, it's very expensive to run. So we had this incredibly rapid expansion, which of course is fascinating. What was driving that? What were the mechanisms? And yeah, several theories, several ideas. Equally interesting to me was why that expansion stalled. If you have this rapid expansion, accelerating curve, very, as I say, very expensive to build and run, what on earth's going on there? And then why did it stall? Because again, that's pretty much accepted. Then, as you say, actually there's been a shrinkage. You know, the neural system's been shrinking, certainly over the last 10, 20,000 years, and possibly for a lot longer. I think the rate of shrinkage is accelerated in recent times, but certainly evidence for shrinkage. Now, of course, some people will point out size and everything, and there's probably some truth in that, but nevertheless, whatever was driving this rapid expansion certainly seems to be worthy of investigating. And is there a correlation there? When this expansion stopped and this shrinkage began, does that in any way connect with these ancient ideas that something went terribly wrong? Because we've been handed these traditions before the advent of modern science. They were pretty much the only source of our natural history, where we came from, and how our mind works and so on. And these traditions, they seem to be universal. The language changes and varies with the culture, but generally speaking, there seems to be talk of a time when we perceived ourselves very differently, wholly differently, in a way we almost certainly wouldn't recognize now. Then something changed, and the explanations vary, but something changed, and then there was an emergence of a perception or a sense of self that was closer to what we'd recognize as human today, and that usurped and generally took over this earlier sense of self, which had these mystical illusions, mystic traits associated with it. We've eventually become dominated by the sense that we recognize today, the human sense we recognize in ourselves and each other. But all these traditions say that's not how it used to be, and they all regard this process as some form of separation, some form of degeneration. That's pretty universal. Now, fascinating that exists. It may not prove anything, certainly not to a skeptical and rational mind today, but quite bizarre these traditions exist. And in fact, they all of them have embedded within them a range of techniques or practices that were claimed to help us access the relics of this state that we were losing contact with. Anything from meditation or yoga through to the spiritual and shamanic traditions of modifying our neurochemistry and other powerful techniques, and they were claimed to somehow reconnect us to this lost state. And when you strip away all the dogma and all the belief, they seem to my mind at least, they could be interpreted as initially describing the onset and progression of a neurological condition that was leaving us ever less able to perceive who and what we are, or even that there was anything wrong. So again, they talk about a slide into delusion. Well, if we've become deluded, if we're now suffering from a form of dementia, how on earth would we know?
Your book, Left in the Dark, touches upon this idea that the left brain has become very dominant. And I think people instinctively understand that we have a very left-brain world that prizes security and money and uniformity over other things like creativity and love, in practice anyway. And I'd like to come on to how we might gain access to some of those qualities associated with the right brain later in the interview. But before we get on to that, could you touch upon this unique relationship that we had with some of the plants when we were in our former state?
Yeah. Well, again, I think it's embedded in the ancient traditions, in the Judaic-Christian tradition. There's the story that's come through that particular sort of belief and tradition is the idea that we were naked, so it must have been warm, something to do with forest dwelling, the Garden of Eden, and fruit and even trees are given a special mention in regard to our very genesis. If you think about the word Genesis, our very origins, metaphors or not, and who's to say for sure, it's fascinating that the modern approach, Western science approach, anthropology, primatology, pharmacology, and so on, they say something almost exactly the same. Origins are tropical forest. We were forest dwelling. Well, we know that tropical forests are warm, so we can be naked in the forest without any penalty. We have a frugivorous anatomy. That's not really disputed, despite the general focus that somehow we then became hunters, gatherers, omnivorous. But nevertheless, our archaic, our sort of ancestral home was forest dwelling and frugivorous. So this relationship with the forests, the trees in the forest, and a particularly special relationship, an incredibly unique relationship. And in fact, these are the things I've been looking for in the sort of the evidence, wherever it comes from. What are the unique factors here? Is there anything we've missed? Anything that may tell us something? And it's pretty well accepted that primates generally, and certainly some of our extinct and living relatives, had a particular relationship with plants where the plants were almost competing for our attention in order to be part of their reproduction, part of their sexual reproduction. How does that come about? Well, they wanted their seeds disseminated. So the emergence of fruit, this swelling of the plant's sex organ. Remember, this is a plant sex organ, the reproductive organ, is a response to what we call a symbiotic association, a symbiotic relationship where animals form relationships with plants and there's a kind of mutual benefit going on. In our case, again, it was about ingesting the sex organs of a whole other kingdom. Okay, now if you think about that for a minute, that's pretty damned unusual. And it's not just then about a choice of something different to eat. It's not, well, shall we eat leaves? Shall we eat roots? Shall we eat insects? Shall we eat animals? We're talking about the reproductive, the sex organ, the developmental organ of a whole other kingdom. And what's going on in there? Well, the biochemistry is pretty damn weird. It's full of all sorts of chemicals to build a whole new plant, to produce the seeds, and the sex organs swelling up with the very chemistry that the plant has sort of evolved to create this incredibly specialized environment. It's like the equivalent of the mammalian uterus. So we're forming a relationship with this biochemically incredibly complex environment full of hormonally active chemicals, all sorts of stuff. Well, when you're ingesting that and it's becoming an increasingly big part of your diet, which diet doesn't do it any justice, you're flooding yourself with perhaps the most complex chemical cocktail in the whole of evolutionary history. Remember, we know the tropical forests produce phenomenal biochemistry. And then each species is pumping the best of that biochemistry, including a lot of hormonally active chemistry, into its own developmental environment, its own sex organ. And then that's the basis of this relationship. So we're flooding ourselves with the combined, biochemical know-how of these species, perhaps 50 species, perhaps 100 species, perhaps more. We don't know, because primates, certainly they don't typically just focus on one species. So we're getting a massive influx of chemistry. And we know that chemistry is quite capable of changing the way our DNA is read and changing the way our own hormone regime works, which in turn, of course, plays a role in reading our DNA. So it's like forming a relationship in such a way that can open the door at least to changing our very structure, changing the way we develop. And the definition of a symbiotic association is just that. Instead of thinking of humans as an individual species, which is currently what we do, we need to start looking at, really, this is a symbiotic organism. And what emerged out of that, what emerged out of this evolutionary process is symbiotic. If our neural system, particularly our neocortex, if that expanded in the forests rather than on the savannas, where a lot of people have been kind of thinking that happened, then our neocortex is symbiotic, and it cannot possibly develop properly, it cannot possibly function properly if all the cool biochemistry was coming from the forest, coming from these reproductive organs that the plants were producing quite intentionally to tempt us to take the seed away. If that's what was going on, then basically there's no wonder our brain stopped expanding. There's no wonder it's been shrinking, and it's chronically deficient in a whole raft of chemistry that we haven't even begun to consider, because most of the researchers are looking at our genome, our DNA, and what's the mystery to human evolution? What's the mystery to our brain? And we had the Human Genome Project, expected to come up with all sorts of wonderful answers. Well, actually, the results have been, it's a pretty typical mammalian genome after all. It's not so different to other mammalian genomes. But if all the cool stuff was coming from the plant genomes, which, by the way, typically are much more complex than animal genomes, and they produce way more biochemistry, if we're really more like a hybrid organism, quite rare for sure, but we know it happens. We know it can happen. And primates, certainly, again, it's in the orthodox literature, forming these symbiotic associations, and it's known that the seed dissemination was part of this association. Nobody seems to put the very basic biochemistry in the same place. If we're ingesting this complex cocktail 24/7 for millions of years, there's no way it can't have had a massive impact. And of course, one of the most sensitive parts of our physiology, one of the most sensitive parts to hormonal change, is our neural system. Incredibly delicate. So there's a big smoking gun there. In fact, I'd say it's more than a smoking gun. The evidence stacks up. If you're willing to juggle the pieces of the jigsaw, they fit. it makes sense.
Yeah, and what really resonated with me in your book is where you mention this feedback loop in that symbiotic relationship that might have allowed our brains to expand so quickly. And just to reiterate for people, what happens is the plants rely on us to transport their seeds to other fertile ground, since these pass through our bodies and end up in the soil again in their own fertilizer. And the plants which we humans like the most, which make us feel the best, which make us the healthiest, will thrive themselves because we'll be eating more of those, transporting their seeds everywhere. And so through the process of eating, we will be planting more of the food that's best for us. And interestingly, what I think mainstream science ignores a bit is the fact that because the plants are going through our own bodies, our chemicals trigger their hormonal switches within one generation, which will cause the DNA of that plant to be expressed differently, presumably to make the plant even more adapted to humans, you know? So this is a proper dialogue here, and the result would be in nature the growing of fruit that's ever increasingly good for us. And this very symbiotic process might have been the thing that caused our brains to grow so fast, given that we were the ape that ate a high percentage of fruit as opposed to green leaves.
Well, it certainly opens the door to what you might call fast-track evolution, and it might more easily, well, I think it certainly more easily explains the potential for massive expansion, you know, accelerating expansion, because you know, I completely agree. If the variation, if all the variation was primarily coming from the plant genomes, and absolutely, I mean, I often say in talks, you know, one way to look at it is like the plants were competing with each other. They're like drug dealers or prostitutes on the corner waving their swollen sex organs. And you know, the whole thing, it does get pretty sexy. And of course, we're going to be attracted to the fruits of the sex organs that feel best in us. Now, if that complex chemistry that makes us feel good happens to be the same chemistry that can expand our juvenile windows by changing our hormone regime, allowing the brain to grow bigger and so on, you end up exactly as you say with the potential for very fast track evolution. And the plants have the capacity to respond to this. They have this phenomenal diversity in the capacity to produce biochemistry, and they're going to be fighting hard. I mean, you know, these sound like conscious approaches. Well, just taking it in a very dry evolutionary sense, the powerful selective forces are going to literally weed out the plants that don't pump in the chemistry that we're after. And the more of that we begin selecting, as you point out, that's going to help proliferate the very species that are producing exactly what we need. And if that happens to be a formula that can ultimately result in a whole new kind of neural system, bringing with it different kinds of traits, like a radically and wholly different sense of self, a level of empathy that perhaps now we barely glimpse anymore. You know, the levels that are the kind of characteristics that our distant ancestral mythology ascribes to our states in those times. You know, people do get glimpses of these still, and they're struck dumb. They can't even find the words to express how amazing it feels and how connected they feel and how they feel a profound sense of empathy and joy and love for everybody and everything. Well, if that was a product of this relationship, and then that relationship breaks down, it begins to explain the physical changes, i.e., the brain stops expanding rapidly and begins to shrink. Our developmental windows begin to shrink, the very windows needed to grow this big thing. And of course, much more importantly, our perception, our sense of self, who we think we are, and our behavior also begins to change and really just begins to revert back to a typical mammalian neural system. Very effective, very good at competing, very good at surviving, not too bright, not a huge amount of empathy, not a huge amount of compassion. That's what you get with symbiosis. It's not, like you're saying, it's not encoded for in our DNA in the way that evolution typically works. It's come about through this association where the biochemistry of the plants was reading our DNA differently, building something radically different, and providing the operating system, providing the neuroactive chemistry that our mammalian DNA cannot produce. And that's how we ended up with something phenomenally unique. But it was based on this partnership, this unique and very, very deep symbiotic union. And again, no real contradiction in the modern data. just the context, just how we've addressed the questions and how we're trying to make sense of who and what we are. And then we end up in this process of regression or reverting to type. As our neural system began, well, the expansion stalled. It began to shrink, and we began losing this unique architecture, this unique neural architecture. However, and rather bizarrely, one side of our brain began to revert to primitive type more quickly than the other. It could have been either side, and there are reasons for this. It turns out it looks very much like it's the left side of our brain. It's reverting to its more primitive original form prior to this symbiotic union much more quickly. And paradoxically and unfortunately, it's ended up in charge. So back to some of these initial questions, the questions I'm trying to draw attention to. Is it possible, just asking the question, is it possible the left side of our brain isn't specially adapted and highly advanced? Because remember, all the evidence suggests it's perceptually dominant. It gives us our primary sense of who we are. So it's looking at these questions and going, oh yeah, I've got specialized abilities. The left brain's got specialized abilities, and I'm not quite sure what the right brain does. Let's turn this around for a minute. Is it possible that the left side of our brain is actually a very dysfunctional version of the right? Is that remotely possible? Now, if it's not, if there's no evidence at all to support that, then I'm heading down the wrong path here. However, when you look at the data, particularly coming out of the split brain research, it's been around for a good 40 years or more, and you step back and don't buy into the presumptions of specialized adaptation, and you look at some of the so-called specialist traits of the left hemisphere, oh my God, it's scary what's actually in the literature. You know, it's so absurd. You've got people, there have been PhD papers written trying to explain, for example, why we deceive ourselves, you know, why the left hemisphere is so susceptible to delusion, why, for example, it confabulates, why does it lie to itself all the time and it doesn't even know it's doing it.
And is there a reason it does that?
Well, I'm not saying there is a purpose. I'm just pointing out the bizarre nature of where we're at. We're trying to explain these so-called specialized traits. What if they're not specialized traits? What if they're symptoms of a neurological condition? You know, would we try and explain somebody's bizarre behavior once we've, in our current way of thinking, once we've made a diagnosis that somebody has pretty serious dementia? Then would we bother writing papers on why they'd stick a knife in themselves if they were given a knife? No, we wouldn't. We'd just say there's a serious problem here and they need some serious care.
Well, we've spoken for half an hour. Thank you so much, Tony. I want to get some reaction from the people after assimilating all that, but I find this information just fascinating. We'll be hearing more from Tony again next week, dear listener, and talking more about what you can find in that right.